Hi, my name is Scott Dolich and I'm the Director of Retail at Stone Soup. Stone Soup is a very tiny little workforce rehabilitation program right here in Northwest Portland, and we help folks who are experiencing barriers of employment get back into the workforce from a culinary standpoint. And I've been here at Stone Soup for about 3 years, and I'm currently the Director of Operations. And one of the things that I do here all the time is make soups. So I'm gonna make one of my favorite soups, mainly because it's one of the simplest ones, and it can be done with Delicata squash, which I've got here right now. And you could do it with carrots, you could do it with sweet potatoes, you could do it with any number of starchy winter vegetables. You could also do it with things like tomatoes too. So we'll provide you with a recipe, but you can substitute in a number of different ingredients for this. So without further ado, I'll just get started because it's a really quick and easy soup to make. So I'm going to start with, this is an 8-quart pot, but we don't really need it to be quite that big. And I'm putting a tiny bit of olive oil down in the center of the pot. And this technique is what I call the cold pot technique, which means that we're starting it cold. There's no like fancy techniques that are involved in this at all. It really is just like filling a pot up with a bunch of ingredients stepwise, and we build a nice flavor base at the beginning of the soup, which I'll show you when we get there. And then after that, it really is just like adding ingredients and layering ingredients in there. And from a very simple standing and starting point, you can get this really delicious soup. So I'm just peeling up these onions here, and we'll do what's called a sliver cut, and we do this a lot at Stone Soup because we do a lot of pureed soups, which this one will be a pureed soup. And the purpose of using a slivered cut, especially for onions, is that it's easy to do. You can go through a lot of onions, like we have to make sometimes 5 or 10 gallons of soup. And if you're dicing it, that's going to take a long time to prep. Right? So as you can see, there's some portions to this onion that, like, they're not necessarily rotten, but they're not good. So I'm going to peel those out, and I don't want to lose this whole onion because we paid for it, right? So I'm just going to conservatively kind of cut through that and make sure that none of that gets into our soup. Some of you might be familiar with this. So you're basically like cutting around like a clock, and you're getting these slivers that are all basically the same size. And they don't have to be super small because we're going to be cooking them down and pureeing them. And it really takes no time at all to cut a whole bunch of onions like this without having to dice them. And that means that there's a little less crying involved, which is always good. So I'm just putting them in the pot. You'll notice that the pot is cold. I'm going to put a small pinch of salt in here to kind of help release some of the moisture that's in those onions. And then I'm going to turn the pot on to like probably a medium level, medium low. I'm going to put a top on that so that it steams. So we're just going to let that do its thing. And the idea here is that whatever vegetables that you have in there, onions, it could be garlic too, they kind of soften up and they get translucent and soft and sweet. So that's what we're going to be looking for. And in the meantime, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these Delicata squash up into half moons. And when I'm cutting, what you'll see is, by the way, cutting squash is definitely an interesting endeavor. Please be careful when you're cutting squash, right? It's really easy to cut yourself. So I'm always usually very careful with my left hand, and I cut slowly and deliberately, cutting it down. And one of the really cool things about Delicata squash is the skin is edible. It's got tons of fiber, lots of minerals. So I don't waste it, like I don't peel it. So everything is going to go into the soup. And with the cost of ingredients these days, I think it really makes sense to use as much as you can. So I'm just kind of going through this, and I'm cutting this Delicata squash into about 1/4 inch, 1/3 of an inch. And here too, I'm using the seeds. As some of you probably already know, those seeds are pepitas. So if I wanted to, a really cool garnish for this soup would be to take all these seeds out, take all the pulp and goop out, toast them, and garnish your soup with that. I'm just kind of putting them in here, and they add a kind of a nuttiness to the soup. And like I said before, this soup, we've done similar soups with parsnips with the same spice profile, same technique. We've done curried carrot soup. In the summertime, we've done summer squash with this as well. And this soup is it's vegan and gluten-free. You can add cream to this, and it's delicious. But I find that this soup, it really doesn't need that much dairy at all. But you can also use, one of the things I like about this soup is that it's a little bit of a blank canvas in that it's delicious on its own, and it also dresses up a whole lot of other garnishes. You know, if you do eat protein, if you eat meat, grilled shrimp is fantastic with it. You can use paneer, any number of things. I've used it with grilled chicken before. So it's a really versatile soup. All right, so I can start to hear my pot starting to get hot. I can hear the onions starting to cook. So I'm just going to give them a brief stir, make sure they're not burning. That's one of the good things about this particular technique, is that it's a pretty forgiving technique. If I get a tiny bit of color on those onions, it's really not a big deal. We've done a lot of these cold pot soups where we do end up caramelizing our onions and garlic, and it gives that kind of deep flavor, that deep caramel flavor that goes really well with winter vegetables in particular. But that's not what I'm looking for from this particular soup. We're just looking to soften them up and get that sweetness and make sure that like sulfury nature of raw onions is cooked out. So I've cut up about 4 pounds of Delicata squash here, and that's going to be plenty for our soup today. What we're doing is going to make about 4 quarts of soup, so roughly a gallon. And depending on how you want to use it, that's about, what does that come to, 16 portions or so. If you're having a big party and you just want to serve this as an appetizer, you could get more soups than that. This soup happens to freeze really nicely. So you can use part of it and then freeze it. We do that here quite a bit. Okay. So we're at the point now, we've been cooking for 5 or 7 minutes, and this is starting to get to the point where you can see all this. These onions are starting to get nice and soft, and I can smell them now, which is a good indicator that they're starting to sweeten up a little bit. They don't have that sulfury smell. And that's kind of what we're after. We're after getting these onions a little bit sweet to the point where they're starting to turn translucent. And now I can start to build my flavor base. And flavor base is something that we talk a lot about in when we're making soups. It's a soup because it's not just dumping vegetables into a pot and putting some water into it and boiling it. Like, you'll get a soup that way, but you won't have the flavor, the depth of flavor that you will if you put a little bit more time and effort into just building a flavor base. And flavor bases are things that aren't new to cooking. They've been used forever and ever, like the Spanish and a lot of the Latin American countries use their sofrito, which is like tomatoes and onions and garlic and peppers usually. So that's a great flavor base. This one is more of a Southeast Asian flavor base. So this one's got onions, curry, a whole bunch of different spices in there. There's cinnamon, there's coriander, there's ground ginger, lots of different spices. There's about 10 spices in this recipe. And like now is when the time is that we like to try to taste the flavor base. So that's another thing that we do a lot of is taste. Unfortunately, it's one of the things that I have to remind people of a lot because this is why we're here, right? It needs to taste good. And so it has what I'm wanting to taste right now. It's really powerful. The curry paste that we use is really spicy. So right now I'm probably going to start sweating a little bit because I'm bald. And it's salty and it's like very, very intense. But we're going to be adding all of the squash. We're going to be adding coconut milk. We're going to be adding a little bit of oil to it, water. So that's going to get diluted a little bit. But this is what I'm looking for. This is what I consider to be a really good flavor base. So I'm going to stick that back on the stove. And I'm going to add squash. And I'm going to add water. And now I'm going to let it rip for a couple of minutes until the squash cooks. And with delicata squash, you know, it's probably 15 minutes or so before that squash gets soft enough to puree. Carrots or turnips, you'll have to cook those out for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, but that just depends on your vegetable. So our delicata squash has been cooking in here for about 10-15 minutes, and if you can see that, we're starting to kind of marry all the ingredients. It's starting to, all the starches from this squash are starting to leach into the soup, and it has that nice, beautiful yellow golden color to it. So that tells me that it's time to add our coconut milk, and I've already mixed this up, as most of you know. Usually the fat kind of goes to the top and then the milk goes to the bottom. It's a good idea to incorporate those so that like when you pour it out, it doesn't just don't get fat or milk. And I love coconut milk. I'm like an addict for it, so I tend to add more than most people do. This really only needs about a cup. I'm going to put in probably most of this because I like it. And so another thing about seasonings, especially with this particular recipe, keep in mind that recipes are organic. Like, you can do them once or twice, and then once you get a handle on your recipe, you should make it your own. That's an important thing about cooking, especially if you do a lot of it. Like, you don't always have to follow the recipe if you're comfortable with that. So another thing that I like to do with this soup is I love spicy food. So when I make a soup that's like this, that has a profile that supports spice, I go to town. Like, I'm adding habaneros or habanadas or whatever you could find at the market. Even though this soup, the curry paste is pretty hot. So now is a good time for me to be tasting this soup because our next step is going to be blending it. So that tastes really good to me. I'm going to add a tiny bit more salt than the recipe called for. And that too, this goes back to knowing your ingredients a little bit and understanding them. Sometimes an ingredient, depending on the time of year, will need more salt, or it'll need more water, or it'll need more spice, or less. So it's important to understand that and to just taste through, trust your palate. It will tell you what to do. I'll show you the soup before I blend it, because to me, like, this soup is beautiful. Like, if you don't have a nice blender and if you don't have the time or the inclination to buzz this in a VitaPrep or another type of blender, like, don't do it. This is beautiful. Like, this actually is a really, really nice soup. Obviously, I've got the seeds and the tips in here, which some people would be really cool with and some people wouldn't, but I'm gonna puree this. But just know that this step is optional. If you want to just go and do this, it took about a half an hour, 40 minutes to make, and it could be your meal without this. So just keep that in mind. And so I'm gonna fill this up, maybe halfway or so. It's a relatively common no-no when you're blending stuff, especially hot stuff. Be really careful. Don't fill your blender up all the way because it will go through the roof. Literally, it'll explode in your blender, and it's dangerous. So I'm filling it up, a little less than half, and I'm gonna put a splash of lemon juice in there. You can use different acids if you want. You could use white wine or apple cider vinegar. I like lime juice and lemon juice in this particular soup. I think it just adds a nice counterpart to the creaminess of the coconut milk. And so we're going to start it on slow. And we'll crank it up a little bit. Here again, I'm going to taste it because sometimes the sum is different than the parts when you blend stuff, which is always an interesting thing. Usually, like when you're incorporating air or something like that into whatever you're cooking, it tends to mute the flavors a tiny bit. So I'm going to add a tiny bit more salt to this. And give it one more shot. So this is our final blended soup. Has a lovely, really silky, beautiful consistency and lovely color. This is like one of my favorite winter colors here. And as the cook, it's always good to make sure that you're pleasing yourself. There you go. It's a wrap.